Welcome to the deep dive. We're looking at a fascinating collection of sources today, all centered around November 10th, 2025. And honestly, they show a world pulling in some very different directions.
That's right. Our goal here is to really pull out the critical threads for you. We've got everything from, revolutionary science to some really tough questions about accountability playing out across the globe.
Yeah, it's quite a mix, so we've kind of organized this around three main themes we saw emerging.
Exactly. First, some major leaps in clean energy. Second, this big, often messy push for accountability, think politics, media, climate action. And third, we're actually seeing some decades-old geopolitical mysteries starting to unravel.
Okay, let's jump in. And I agree we should probably start with the good news, because there's a development in solar power here that sounds genuinely exciting. The sources say it rivals its rigid counterpart.
It really does. And this is a potential game changer because for so long, high efficiency meant rigid panels. Glass, aluminum frames.
Right, flexibility always came with a big performance hit.
Exactly, but now we're seeing these flexible solar cells, specifically a perovskite crystalline silicon tandem design that have hit a certified efficiency of 33.6%.
33.6%. Wow, that really is up there with the best standard rigid panels.
But it's flexible.
That's the key. You could theoretically roll this stuff up, which opens up all sorts of applications.
Okay, that number is impressive. But my first thought is durability. Flexible things, especially solar cells, tend to break down faster, right? How did these hold up under stress?
That's the crucial question, and this is where the material science gets really interesting. Endurance is everything for solar tech, and these cells did remarkably well. They kept 91% of their original efficiency.
91%.
After being bent 5,000 times. And this wasn't just a gentle curve. We're talking a tight bend radius, 17.6 millimeters.
5,000 bends and only a 9% drop. That tackles one of the biggest hurdles for flexible solar, surely. What about just running them constantly? Or, weather, heat and humidity? Good questions. They looked at operational stability, too. They talk about a T80 lifetime. That's the time it takes to drop to 80% efficiency of over 2,000 hours while running continuously under light.
Okay, T80 over 2,000 hours. So still performing really well after quite a while.
Precisely. And maybe even more importantly for real-world use, they subjected them to damp heat testing. Think harsh, humid conditions.
Right. The killer for electronics.
Exactly. And they retained 90% of their efficiency after 9,000 hours of that.
Okay, so they're efficient and surprisingly tough. How? What's the secret sauce here?
Well, it gets a bit technical, but it's down to some really advanced materials engineering in the layers of the cell. They mention things like a special recombination layer. It's indium oxide doped with cerium and hydrogen, deposited using reactive plasma.
Okay, you lost me slightly there with the chemistry jargon.
Yeah, it's complex. And also a specific type of front electrode zinc-doped indium oxide that's annealed during the process.
So basically, they've found clever ways to layer these materials and treat them to stabilize the core chemistry. The perovskite part, which is usually the fragile bit.
You've got it. That's the breakthrough. Making something that's potentially high efficiency, also durable and flexible enough for the real world. It's a fantastic example of science potentially solving a huge energy problem.
Okay, from science solving problems to more. Well, problems that seem much harder to solve. Let's shift gears to global policy and accountability. This brings us to the COP30 climate talks kicking off in Belém, Brazil. The big theme, apparently, is implementation. Moving past just making promises.
Right, implementation. But if that's the goal, one of the sources points out a really glaring blind spot. A UN-backed report found that 70% of countries don't even mention soil as a climate mitigation tool in their main climate action plans, their NDCs.
70%, wait, soil, as in dirt. How is that a major climate tool?
Well, healthy soil is actually the planet's larger carbon sink after the oceans. The potential is enormous. The report suggests that restoring degraded agricultural soils could sequester enough carbon to deliver 27% of the emission cuts we need globally to stay under that 2-degree warming target.
27%, just from better farming and land management? Why on earth are countries ignoring it then?
It seems to be a focus issue. Countries are talking about agriculture in their NDCs, but mostly about adaptation, how to cope with climate change impacts on farming.
So how to survive, not how to fix it.
Exactly. They're not focusing on the mitigation potential using soil health practices to actively draw down carbon. It's seen as maybe too local, too complex to measure compared to, say, building a wind farm. It's a massive missed opportunity.
And this lack of focus, or maybe lack of commitment, seems to run right up against powerful competing interests, doesn't it? The sources also flag a big new fossil fuel project, ExxonMobil in Greece.
Yes, in the Ionian Sea, off the Greek coast. They're planning to start offshore drilling for natural gas by early 2027.
And this is controversial.
Hugely. Greece and the U.S. government actually frame it as vital for energy security, especially to replace Russian gas. The U.S. Energy Secretary even called the deal historic.
Oh.
But environmental groups are understandably outraged. They call it profoundly out of step with climate goals, particularly given the biodiversity of the Ionian Sea. It's a direct clash between energy security narratives and climate action.
Which leads us straight back to the COP negotiations themselves.
Right.
Because there's a push to clean up who's even in the room. Right. The lobbyist issue.
Yeah, a really pointed demand, yes. NGOs are calling for an official ban on fossil fuel lobbyists attending the COP talks.
Is it really that bad? How many are we talking about?
Get this. Over the last 4 COPs, more than 5,350 accredited delegates were lobbyists linked to fossil fuel interests.
5,000?
Yeah, representing companies like ExxonMobil, BP, the very companies, the analysis notes, responsible for 57% of the oil and gas produced globally last year. So the argument is, how can you have meaningful implementation talks when the biggest players hindering implementation are right there influencing the rules?
It certainly undermines the whole process. And if the negotiators are potentially compromised, what about the public watchdogs? The media. There's criticism there, too.
Yes. Mark Hertsgaard calls the absence of U.S. TV networks at COP30 a tragic abdication of responsibility.
Why aren't they going? Is it just too expensive?
Budgets are cited, yes. But Hertsgaard also points to something more worrying. A fundamental lack of climate literacy among many newsroom managers. They still don't grasp it as the core economic, political, and social story it is. It gets siloed as just an environment story.
So lobbyists potentially influencing policy inside?
Yeah.
And the lack of mainstream media scrutiny outside? That's not great combination for driving change.
Not at all. It highlights a systemic failure. Though it's worth noting a contrast mentioned while media and policy might be lagging, other efforts push on. Prince William's Earthshot Prize, for example, just awarded winners, including projects in Brazil, marking the halfway point in its decade of change.
So some high-level focus remains, even if it's outside the main political and media channels. Okay, let's shift again, this time to geopolitical flashpoints and historical accountability finally catching up.
We're heading to Mexico first, and a really significant development in a case that has lingered for decades. The 1994 assassination of the presidential frontrunner, Luis Donaldo Colosio.
That name is iconic in Mexico. What's the news?
Federal prosecutors have arrested a second suspect, Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega. He was apparently apprehended in Tijuana.
A second suspect? I thought there was a confessed killer, Mario Burto, who's been in prison all this time.
There is. Burto is serving a 45-year sentence, but he later claimed he was tortured into confessing. This new arrest points to a different narrative. Sanchez Ortega, identified as Jorge Antonio S. in reports, was actually an intelligence agent.
An intelligence agent? Working for whom?
For CISIN, Mexico's intelligence agency at the time. And he was assigned as part of Colosio's bodyguard detail on the day of the assassination.
Wait, a bodyguard is now a suspect? What's the evidence?
Prosecutors are citing things like blood spatters on Sanchez Ortega's clothing matching Colosio's type, and crucially, ballistic evidence suggesting a second gunshot distinct from Burto's weapon.
A second shooter.
That's the implication. And the prosecution alleges a criminal cover-up by CISIN officials back in 1994, claiming they basically spirited Sanchez Ortega away from the crime scene immediately after the shooting.
Wow. So this isn't just about a second gunman, it's potentially about state involvement or, at minimum, a massive cover-up by the intelligence services. That rewrites history.
It absolutely could, if proven. It fuels theories that have simmered in Mexico for 30 years.
Okay, moving from historical cover-ups to present-day battles against corruption. Let's talk about Ukraine. There's a major probe underway there.
Yes. Ukraine's anti-corruption agency, MBU, has launched a significant investigation targeting the state-owned nuclear power company, Energoatom.
Energoatom, that's huge, especially now. What are they investigating?
It's focused on alleged misappropriation of funds, potentially around $100 million or 87 million euros. The investigation itself sounds massive. They mention 15 months of work analyzing 1,000 hours of audio recordings to uncover what they call a highly organized criminal network within the company.
$100 million.
Yeah.
That's serious money. And the timing is critical, isn't it? With Ukraine's EU bid
Yeah.
and the war.
Extremely critical. Proving they can tackle high-level corruption like this is absolutely essential for their EU aspirations. But think about the context. They're doing this while Russia is relentlessly attacking their power grid, specifically targeting the substations that connect these very nuclear plants to the grid.
So they're fighting corruption internally while trying to keep the lights on under bombardment.
Exactly. It shows an incredible level of commitment to reform, even under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It's a fight on two fronts.
We also have a couple of other notable international items from the sources. First, the release of Moammar Gadhafi in Lebanon.
Yes, the son of the former Libyan leader. He'd been held in Lebanon for about 10 years. A Libyan delegation apparently negotiated his release.
How did that happen? Was it diplomatic pressure?
It seems partly diplomatic, but the key detail was financial. His bail had been set at an astronomical $11 million. A judge then drastically reduced it to $900,000, still a lot, but payable, which the Libyan delegation covered. So money talked.
Interesting. And finally, a really tragic event in India.
Yes, an immediate incident, a car explosion near the historic Red Fort in New Delhi. Early reports indicate at least 8 deaths and 19 injuries. India's National Investigation Agency, their federal anti-terror unit, is leading the investigation into the cause.
Terrible situation there.
Okay,
Let's bring it back home in a sense by focusing on the institutions that shape our understanding of all these events.
Yeah.
The media. There's a huge story about media accountability involving the BBC.
A massive one. Donald Trump's legal team is threatening the BBC with a lawsuit demanding $1 billion, yes, billion, with a B, in damages over a recent Panorama documentary called Trump, A Second Chance.
$1 billion. What's the basis for such a huge claim? It sounds designed to intimidate.
The core of the claim is about a specific edit in the documentary. They allege that the program misleadingly spliced together 2 separate lines from Trump's speech on January 6, 2021.
Which lines?
The line urging supporters to walk down to the Capitol and another line from a different part of the speech urging them to fight like hell.
So the accusation is that by putting those 2 phrases together, it created a false impression that he was directly telling the crowd to march on the Capitol and fight violently, all in one breath.
Precisely. That's the crux of the legal threat, that the edit misrepresented his words to imply direct incitement at that specific moment.
Has the BBC responded? $1 billion threat isn't something you just ignore.
They have, and the fallout internally has been significant. The BBC chairman, Samir Shah, actually issued a public apology, calling the edit an error of judgment and acknowledging it did give the impression of a direct call for violent action.
An apology from the chairman. It's major.
It is, and following that, both the Director General of the BBC and the Chief Executive of BBC News resigned from their posts.
Wow. So major heads rolled over this editing decision.
Yes. It's forced a huge internal discussion at the BBC about editorial standards, accuracy, and potential bias. The source notes this comes amidst other criticisms they've faced recently over coverage of different sensitive topics, though the BBC denies systemic bias. But this specific incident clearly crossed a line internally.
Okay, so we've journeyed from incredible tech breakthroughs to climate policy failures, historical crimes resurfacing, ongoing conflicts, and now a major crisis in media accountability. How do we tie all these seemingly disparate threads together? What's the underlying tension here?
I think the defining tension is this stark contrast between human ingenuity and systemic dysfunction. On one hand, we see brilliant science, like the 33.6% efficient flexible solar cells, offering real pathways to solve enormous global challenges like energy access and climate change.
Right, the solutions are emerging.
But on the other hand, we see these deep-seated failures in our systems of governance and information. 70% of nations overlooking a primary natural climate solution like soil. Political crimes covered up for decades. Critical anti-corruption efforts happening under literal bombardment. And major news organizations facing existential threats over basic editorial missteps. The technology is racing ahead, but our ability to manage ourselves, to implement solutions fairly and transparently, that seems to be lagging badly.
That captures it perfectly. The potential is there, particularly in science and tech, like that amazing solar development. But the human system's political will, institutional integrity, media responsibility are struggling to keep up or even actively working against progress. So let's leave you, our listener, with a final thought, building directly on that shocking climate statistic we discussed. If the single largest carbon sink on Earth readily available to us, our soil is being actively ignored in the climate plans of 70% of the world's nations, what powerful, maybe simpler, non-technological solution might you be overlooking in your own work, your own community, or even your own thinking, just because it doesn't have the flash of high tech or the weight of established policy? What fundamental are we missing?